Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower, 1993, is one of the most visionary and unsettling works of late 20th century speculative fiction. Set in a near future America ravaged by climate change, economic collapse, and social disintegration, the novel portrays a world where traditional social structures have broken down and human survival depends on adaptability, empathy, and community. Through the eyes of its protagonist, Lauren Olamina, Butler constructs a prophetic narrative that transcends science fiction conventions, blending dystopian realism with philosophical and spiritual inquiry. The result is a work that is both a warning and a blueprint, a story about destruction and rebirth, despair and hope, faith and survival. 1. Setting the scene: collapse and disintegration. The story begins in 2024 in the fictional suburb of Robledo, California, where Lauren Olamina, a 15-year-old African-American girl, lives with her family inside a walled community. Outside their walls, America has descended into chaos. Years of climate catastrophe, droughts, fires, and rising sea levels have eroded the nation's infrastructure and economy. Corporate greed, privatization, and the collapse of public institutions have left most people destitute. Law and order have vanished, and roving bands of drug addicts, thieves, and arsonists terrorize the roads. The streets are filled with people desperate for food, shelter, and safety. Butler's Dystopia is grounded in a grim realism that makes it disturbingly plausible. Unlike the sleek technological futures of traditional science fiction, Butler's world is one of scarcity, decay, and regression. The wealthy retreat into privatized walled enclaves, while the poor scavenge through the ruins of civilization. The novel's world building anticipates real-world crises of inequality, climate change, and mass migration, issues that have become increasingly relevant since the book's publication. Butler foresaw how the social fabric could unravel under pressure, exposing the fragile interdependence of modern life. 2. Lauren Olamina and hyper-empathy. At the center of this crumbling world stands Lauren Olamina, one of Butler's most compelling and complex heroines. Lauren is intelligent, observant, and unusually self-aware. She suffers from hyperempathy syndrome, a psychological condition that makes her physically feel the pain and pleasure of others. This condition, caused by her mother's use of a drug called paracetamol, becomes both her curse and her gift. It forces her to confront the suffering around her in visceral ways, but it also becomes the foundation of her moral vision. In a world that has lost its sense of compassion, Lauren's hyperempathy makes her vulnerable, yet it also equips her to imagine a new kind of community based on shared suffering and collective care. Butler uses this condition as a metaphor for radical empathy, the ability to truly experience the pain of others and respond with action. In this sense, Lauren's hyperempathy is not a weakness, but a revolutionary force that opposes the numbness and cruelty of her society. The birth of Earthseed. Lauren's journey is not only physical, but also spiritual. As she witnesses the breakdown of her world, she begins to formulate a new belief system she calls Earthseed. The central tenet of Earthseed is starkly simple: God is change. From this principle flows a philosophy of adaptability, responsibility, and transformation. Instead of worshipping an anthropomorphic deity, Earthseed views divinity as a dynamic process, the force of change that governs all existence. Human beings, therefore, have a moral duty to shape change rather than be destroyed by it. Lauren records her developing theology in a journal, interspersing her observations of the world with verses from what will become the Book of the Living. These verses serve as both scripture and prophecy, capturing Butler's poetic vision of a new spiritual consciousness. Earthseed's ultimate destiny, Lauren writes, is to take root among the stars, to reestablish humanity's presence beyond Earth. This cosmic ambition contrasts sharply with the immediate horrors of her world, but it reflects Butler's belief in the potential of human imagination and resilience. Through Earthseed, Butler explores the role of faith in a secular age. Traditional Christianity, represented by Lauren's father, a Baptist minister, has failed to address the realities of the collapsing world. Its promises of salvation seem hollow in the face of environmental ruin and human cruelty. Lauren's Earthseed, by contrast, is pragmatic and forward-looking. It transforms religion from passive submission to active creation. In this sense, Butler reimagines spirituality as an adaptive human strategy for survival in times of crisis. Half 4. The Journey North, from Survival to Community. After her gated community is destroyed by a brutal attack, Lauren is forced to flee northward. Her family is killed, and she joins the mass of refugees walking along California's dangerous highways. On the road, she meets people of different backgrounds. Zara Moss, a former neighbor and survivor of abuse, and Harry Balter, a white youth from her community. Together, they form a fragile alliance as they struggle to find safety. As they journey north, Lauren's vision of Earthseed evolves from a private belief into a social reality. She begins to gather followers, teaching them the principles of adaptability, cooperation, and mutual respect. Their group grows as they encounter others seeking refuge, including Bankoli, an older man who becomes Lauren's partner and an important figure in founding the first Earthseed community. The journey becomes both a physical migration and a spiritual pilgrimage, echoing biblical Exodus narratives, but reinterpreted through a modern, post-apocalyptic lens. Butler's depiction of this group of travelers highlights themes of race, gender, and class. In the absence of state authority, old prejudices resurface violently. Women are especially vulnerable to sexual violence and exploitation. Lauren's leadership challenges patriarchal assumptions as she takes on the role of protector and visionary in a world where traditional male authority has collapsed. Butler thus crafts a feminist reimagining of the survival narrative, one that centers empathy, intelligence, and collaboration over brute strength. 5. Themes of power, change, and adaptation. At its core, Parable of the Sower is a meditation on power and transformation. Like Butler shows how power operates not only through violence and domination, but also through adaptability and resilience. The novel's recurring motif, God is change, suggests that survival depends on understanding and shaping the forces of transformation. Those who resist change, whether through denial, nostalgia, or rigid ideology, perish, while those who embrace it evolve. The novel also critiques capitalism and the myth of individualism. The collapse of society in Parable of the Sower is not merely a natural disaster, but the result of systemic greed and inequality. The privatization of security, education, and even water illustrates the logical endpoint of unrestrained market forces. In this context, Lauren's communal vision of Earthseed represents a radical alternative to competitive individualism, a model of interdependence that redefines freedom as mutual responsibility. Butler's prose is spare yet lyrical, alternating between stark realism and visionary poetry. Her style mirrors Lauren's dual role as survivor and prophet. The journal format gives the narrative an intimate immediacy, while the Earthseed verses elevate it to the level of myth. This tension between realism and prophecy is central to the novel's power. It feels both brutally present and transcendentally future-oriented. 6. Parallels and Prophecy. When Parable of the Sower was first published, its vision of a disintegrating America seemed speculative. Today it reads like a chillingly accurate forecast. Butler foresaw many issues that dominate 21st century discourse: climate change, the privatization of essential services, the erosion of democracy, mass displacement, and the rise of religious and corporate extremism. Her America of 2024 feels eerily close to our own, where social inequality and ecological collapse are daily realities. Yet Butler does not succumb to despair. Even amid devastation, she imagines new forms of solidarity and meaning. Lauren's Earthseed communities offer a model for rebuilding the world from the ashes, a bottom-up approach to spirituality, politics, and survival, rooted in empathy and adaptability. In this way, Parable of the Sower stands as both a warning and a call to action. It challenges readers to confront the consequences of apathy and to participate actively in shaping a better future. Nar 7. Legacy and Interpretation. Parable of the Sower is often read alongside its sequel, Parable of the Talents, 1998, which continues Lauren's story and depicts the rise of a theocratic regime in America. Together, the two novels form Butler's Earthseed series, a prophetic cycle about the evolution of humanity and the power of belief. The series has gained renewed attention in recent years, inspiring adaptations, academic studies, and social movements. Many readers have embraced Earthseed as a real-world philosophy, finding in its principles of adaptability and collective responsibility a guide for navigating the Anthropocene. Butler herself described her work as speculative fiction rather than science fiction, emphasizing its grounding in social and human realities. Parable of the Sower exemplifies this distinction. It uses speculative elements not as escapism, but as tools for examining the present. Butler's vision is anthropological, political, and spiritual, a meditation on what it means to remain human in an inhuman world. Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower is more than a dystopian novel. It is a modern scripture of survival and transformation. Through Lauren Olamina's journey from destruction to creation, Butler redefines faith as a form of action and empathy as a revolutionary force. Her narrative fuses the political and the spiritual, the intimate and the cosmic, offering a new myth for a fractured age. In a time of accelerating crises, climatic, economic, and moral, Butler's words resonate with prophetic urgency. She reminds us that change is inevitable, but survival is not. The future, she insists, belongs to those who can perceive change not as threat, but as opportunity. Parable of the Sower thus endures as both a cautionary tale and a luminous vision of